Good morning from the Utah Valley University Office for Global Engagement. I'm your host, Baldomero Lago, and I welcome you to our program on Taking Action. Taking Action is a virtual discussion among academicians, students, and community members to address the relevance, implementation, and promotion of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. These goals are a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and improve the lives and prospects of everyone, everywhere. The 17 goals were adopted by all the United Nations member states in 2015 as part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which set out a 15-year plan to achieve the goals. Today, we're discussing goal number 16, promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. During the session, feel free to ask questions in the Facebook comments window. If time permits, I will address a select few. Today, I have two wonderful students and one graduate student, experts in this panel that have studied and discussed peace and social justice. Today, this morning, I have with me Mr. Andrew Jensen, Mr. Samuel Elzinga, and Mr. Lee Winkleman. At this point, good morning, gentlemen. It's good to be with you and to take the opportunity to discuss SDG 16. If you don't mind, I will have each of you introduce yourselves, maybe take a couple minutes, tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to this conversation on the SDG 16 on peace, social justice, and peace. So we'll start with Andrew Jensen. Andrew, if you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Dr. Lago. It's a pleasure to get to be here today with these great other panelists. So my name's Andrew Jensen. I'm a National Security Studies and Computer Science major here at UVU. I've been pretty involved with the Office for Global Engagement since I started here at UVU. I've helped to run when we had the Civil Society Conference a few years ago. Sam and I also traveled to the UN back in 2018 to present on sustainable mountain development. And I've just really enjoyed my time here at UVU, and I'm excited to share some of the lessons I've learned about conflict resolution and conflict mitigation.
Thank you very much. Samuel.
Yeah, thanks again, Dr. Lago. So my name's Samuel Elzinga. I'm a senior graduating this May, double majoring in political science and integrated studies. And integrated studies, I emphasize in national security studies and Russian studies. I'm really focused on peace building and conflict in the former Soviet Union. I've done a lot with the Office for Global Engagement, helped host ambassadors. I publish a lot of research on conflict and peace in the former Soviet Union as well. And I was recently selected by the Organization for the Security and Cooperation of Europe to represent, I think, the United States. I'm not sure. I'm one of 32 youth from across the OSCE who's been invited to help develop their youth strategy. And so I start work on that this Friday. And the OSCE is primarily focused on building up peaceful societies and helping post-conflict countries resolve their disputes that are keeping them from building sustainable institutions. And so I'm excited to talk on this panel. I hope I've got something worthwhile to say.
You will. Thank you, Samuel. Lee.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for having me and all of us on this panel this morning. So my name is Lee Winkleman. I am a UVU alumnus. I also studied integrated studies. However, my concentrations were peace and justice studies, psychology, and French language. So once I graduated from UVU in 2018, I went straight to the University of Utah, where I did my master's degree in international affairs and global enterprise, or more commonly called the MIASH program. I tried to focus on courses that had to deal with international conflict. Pretty much whenever it involves peace and conflict, I want to read about it, I want to talk about it, I want to discuss it because it's a topic that I'm very passionate about. Similar to other things that have been said, whenever it involves peace building and conflict transformation, I think these are very important aspects of civil society, of sustainable communities and and organizations. And so I've always tried to gravitate towards those topics. Currently, I've been fortunate enough to find a job post-graduation in all of this pandemic craziness. Just 2 months ago, I started working for the Department of Defense at Hill Air Force Base, working in their logistics, lifecycle logistics department. So I'm really excited for this opportunity. I'm learning a ton, working from home currently, but I can't wait to start working on base.
Thank you very much. What a great honor is to have the three of you that I have known you as students throughout this semester. We have had multiple discussions on taking action, but this is the first time that we have three strong students, and I think you folks are going to, just make it on. This is going to become a very famous panel today because you have a lot to say thanks to your experience. Your experience are fresh, which to me, that's even more relevant. So we're going to go ahead to look at some of the indicators on goal number 16. And just to review the goal, one of the aspects of the goal aims significantly to reduce all forms of violence related to death rates everywhere. I would like to propose 6 world conflicts. And I'm going to ask you to speak on some of these current world conflicts. And perhaps if you have the magic wand to provide or present, what would you do to reduce this conflict, right? What would you do if you have all the power? How would you be able to make peace at the very end? It would be nice to maybe get a little background of this conflict, if you could provide that within a couple of minutes, and then just present a proposal. Well, this could be something that can be addressed, right? So we're going to start with Mr. Samuel. Why don't you talk about what is happening or has happened in Afghanistan? We hear that all the time in the news. Tell us about it, and what would you do?
Absolutely. The conflict in Afghanistan, I think, is very complex and very rooted in both ancient challenges and modern issues as well. So the ancient challenges being historical clan rivalries, the situation of clans and tribes within Afghanistan, and loyalty primarily to those institutions, those subnational ethnic institutions, as opposed to a national government or institution. And then you've got new challenges too, like Islamic extremism. So you see two ends of the spectrum between ancient and modern, and they both come into they both are important explanatory factors in understanding the conflict in Afghanistan. So one of the biggest problems, in my opinion, in finding sustainable peace in Afghanistan is the lack of desire to stand behind a united Afghan state. Again, many Afghan citizens are more interested in developing and keeping their tribal relations, as opposed to coalescing as like a nation state, because they aren't a nation state. They're a group. They're a state that was made up essentially because the Russian Empire couldn't progress any further south, and the British Empire during the 19th century couldn't progress any further north. And so you had the Kingdom of Afghanistan that was made because of that. And since the 19th century, you haven't really had a unifying leader in Afghanistan to keep everyone unified. So things have broken down back to the tribal levels. And so tribal unity is stronger than national unity. You've got, I'd say, about a dozen different ethnic groups who are interested primarily in their own human security, but that doesn't really promote national security, national stability. And so there's just a lack of ability and willpower on the part of the people to help develop national institutions, which then plays into Islamic extremism, people looking to source their own income and looking to do that through illegal black markets, opium trading, things like that, which then in turn finances terrorist operations. And so it's really complex, but that's what I would say is, in the short 3 minutes I've got, what is plaguing Afghanistan. There's a lack of unity and a lack of willpower for everyone. as a country.
That's wonderful. I guess we lost the last 3 seconds of your message. The computer just froze for a second, but if you want
I'm
to
sorry.
reiterate that, just the last thought that you just brought, because it froze.
Yeah, I'd say ultimately, in a nutshell, like the bottom line up front, the bluff here is that intertribal relations are stronger than a national sense of unity, which is hindering development within the country.
Thank you, Samuel. I know we could have done this whole thing on Afghanistan, but we're just simply looking at different regions of the world, and we're in the same region with the Middle East and so forth. So we're going to go to another conflict that not too many individuals are very well aware what's happening. So I've asked Andrew if he could talk to us a little briefly on what is going on in Yemen and Saudi Arabia.
Absolutely. So let me just share my screen here. I prepared a brief little PowerPoint to help walk me through this. So the Yemen conflict is really complex, and it's very difficult to put. It's very difficult to put in context. I did want to provide a few facts, though. It's important to note that you have 10,000 people that have been killed in the last 18 months. 21 million people require urgent humanitarian assistance. You have 3 million people that are suffering from acute malnutrition. You have a child that dies every 10 minutes from malnutrition or disease. And you have about 3.2 million people that are internally displaced. The reason I start with this is I think it's important to understand the Yemen conflict is largely classified as one of the world's worst humanitarian crises right now, just because of the sheer amount of people that have been displaced, the sheer amount of people that are suffering. Yemen has been a problem area for a long time, but recently in the past decade, it's become a serious humanitarian issue. So some brief background kind of on how this all happened. I mean, during the Arab Spring, you had, all these Middle Eastern countries were overthrowing the leadership in those countries. And it was the same for Yemen. So President Saleh was forced from power, and he granted his deputy, President Hadi, leadership of the country. And President Hadi has inherited quite a few problems, including corruption, food insecurity, unemployment, jihadist movements, and a separatist movement in the south. The issue was in 2015, circa 2015, the Houthi rebel group, one of the rebel groups that had been fostering for a long time in Yemen, launched an attack against Sana'a, which is the capital of Yemen, and actually expelled President Hadi from Yemen, and now he lives in Saudi Arabia. So this is kind of one of the difficult complexities of this problem, being that the official seat of government is actually outside of Yemen. It's in Saudi Arabia. And a lot of the neoliberal institutions that are working to kind of help solve problems in Yemen, like the UN and the World Bank, the issue is they have to deal with the official recognized government, but the official recognized government isn't even in Yemen at this point. So that causes a really complex problem and a lot of issues. The Houthis are essentially the de facto leaders that occupy the northern half of the country. And then there's a seat of government down in the southern part of the country in Aden, but the president, again, doesn't even live in Yemen. So this is really important. Now, Baldomero had asked us to talk about if we could wave a magic wand. I did want to share, I did a little bit of research on this actually when I was studying abroad. And I found you'll see that kind of when you look at government funding, so a lot of the funding from the UN and the World Bank goes to the government. And when you pass that through the government primarily funds areas that are predominantly Sunni and predominantly in the government's interest. So you have these 4 areas I've highlighted. You can see those are all either mixed control between the Houthis and the Hadi groups. So it just becomes a really complex issue, especially when you consider that the bottom 4, the funding for this drastically decreases from those primary 4 areas of funding. So the government primarily funds the areas that the government has power or that are kind of these intense conflict zones. And it causes a lot of issues within the country because there's a lot of sentiment that basically Hadi just wants to run it himself. And so the magic wand solution, I did a little bit of research on small and medium enterprise investment. So as a brief background, small and medium firms represent 95% of registered firms worldwide. 50% of jobs. And these are small and medium enterprises that aren't necessarily big corporations, but instead individuals. There's a credit gap of about $1.1 trillion. And in Yemen, that number is closer to 18 trillion if you include the non-formal small and medium enterprises. So you have a really big opportunity here where there's a lot of people that want to contribute to small and medium enterprise development, and that could help them kind of lift themselves out of poverty, but they're not getting financed at all because so much of the funding is primarily focused on the conflict. And that's really important. But I think one of the things we talk about in sustainable development is how do you balance immediate funding and immediate priorities with some of these more long-term ideas like investing in small and medium enterprises, because there's such a large credit gap here. This is a massive chance for improvement. So just to kind of wrap up, one of the important things I think, you have a larger systemic issue for World Bank and neoliberal institution funding, that they only fund the government entities, which causes problems throughout the rest of the country where there might be people suffering and you might have issues. The other option is to shift kind of funding priorities towards sustainable development and working towards more long-term solutions. As of today, there was actually just announced that there's a ceasefire between Saudi Arabia and the Houthi rebels, which is a great step in the right direction. But now the question becomes, how do we rebuild a country that's been utterly devastated for the last decade? And I think it comes from shifting from kind of this immediate assistance to more long-term development solutions. And so like my magic wand waved, I would explore kind of SME development as an option for conflict mitigation and giving more of the people in Yemen the opportunity to develop their own industries. So let me just end this.
Thank you, Andrew. That was absolutely brilliant. So I'm going to see if I can find some phone numbers at the World Bank so we can submit your proposal and we can find a resolution to this decade of conflict. That was fantastic. We're going to go to another topic, and I wish we had time to deliberate on this and look at different proposals, but I selected to just touch on different topics and to see your perspective as students that have studied these areas. We're going to go now to the lovely and wonderful conflict that we have seen since we were born and has gone on for centuries, right? And that is the conflict with Iran, Israel, Persian Gulf conflict, and even the US is involved in this. So Lee, what are your thoughts?
So yeah, there's a lot to unpack with this region. I mean, like you said, we've seen conflicts come and go, for centuries, more recently in the last several decades. Really, if I were to boil it down to its basic, to its basic trace of where the conflict really comes from, it's one of the biggest factors is that Israel was granted statehood and was recognized by the UN and several other international entities. However, many other states in the region didn't agree to this, and they said this isn't fair, this isn't justified. These people, they don't belong in this land. And so, this territorial dispute has kind of blown up and it's, now it's involved in economics and politics, religion, all of these things are a part of it. Now, in all of this conflict, the US and many European actors are also to blame because you have state lines drawn arbitrarily to say, oh, let's make a state here, let's make a state there. Basically, you get a state. They went Oprah Winfrey on the Middle East, kind of, in the second half of the 20th century. And so, I can understand and I see where this anger comes from, where the frustration is. And it's difficult once you've drawn these state lines. How do you go back? How do you all of a sudden go to Israel and say, actually, we're going to strip away your statehood, and and you kind of have to go back to Europe or to Africa or wherever you were displaced previously. So on the topic of a territorial dispute, or at least land, I would say that there's a lot going on with Israel-Palestine. You have different conflict, world-renowned conflict mediators trying to come up with solutions, fully recognizing that whatever solution is proposed, chances are it's going to be shot down, perhaps figuratively and also physically shot down. So when you have, obviously there's a one-state solution, there's a two-state solution. Those are kind of the biggest scenes right now with Israel and Palestine. Which do you choose? Do we further break up Israel into two states and say, this is Palestine, this is Israel. The issue is that there are pieces of land that are just fragmented across what is known as Palestinian territories or Palestinian lands. And so, how do you go back on that? It's such a hard dilemma. I myself am for a two-state solution, but I fully recognize that there are going to be a lot of issues and a lot of opponents to that. Now, let's talk about Iran. Iran also has a very, very big, place in the world, especially in that region. I would say its defining characteristic is its nuclear arms. If you look at any sort of global superpower or even regional superpower, what it really comes down to is they have attained that status, or they've reached that status quo because they have nuclear arms. So my magic wand, really, and this applies to this conflict and many others, but if nuclear arms could just go away, if those never existed, I think there would be a lot of peaceable solutions. There would be a lot less conflict. Perhaps, this realist ideology that is so entrenched in international politics could perhaps transform into liberalism, cooperation between voluntary institutions. So, with Iran, pretty much when it comes to US-Iran relations, tenuous at best. There's a long history of relations where at one point it seemed like things were going pretty well, but again, US and Europe kind of banded together, staged a coup in Iran in the 70s, and this Islamic revolution. I see a lot of US citizens or organizations saying, this Islam, this extreme is Islam in Iran, and this theocracy, it's a problem. However, it was a direct result from US intervention. So I think that trying to blame or point fingers is problematic, but also trying to come up with peaceful solutions. The issue with that is you need everyone on board. You can't make a unilateral decision that involves people's lives, people's their livelihood, by saying, hey, let's all just be buddy-buddies together, because there are, historical grievances that need to be addressed, that need to be confronted. And while I think there are nuclear arms at play, it makes people scared, it makes them paranoid. And that's really where this realist paradigm takes over and takes control. So, again, Persian Gulf, this region, there's so much to unpack. There's so many different states. Arbitrary lines drawn. It's impossible to say, you fit in this box, you fit in that box. Just look at the Kurds, for example. They're the classic textbook case of how this region is far from being conflict-free.
Lee, you're totally, completely right. It's such a complicated scenario right there. And to come up with a solution is going to take more than a divine intervention there. But I do appreciate your thoughts, and it's very complicated, especially who is willing to just give up their nuclear arsenal. You tell me a nation that would be ready just to say, hey, we're just going to turn them off, right? Is a utopia sometimes. But I like your proposal, and I think hopefully individuals that will be listening to this can take that into consideration. So thank you. Samuel, we're going back to you. Let's talk about an interesting conflict that is very, well, I say close to home because I work with some Ukrainians. What's going on in Crimea? Tell us a little bit about the conflict and potential ways of resolving it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting conflict. And again, I think like my other panelists, I'm going to do my best to remain as neutral as possible because this is an issue, I've been taking notes as we've been talking. And one of the big things that I've noticed is identity is a constant throughout all of these conflicts. And so, identity in Crimea, once again, plays a big factor in what's going on. So back in 2014, I guess let's start a little bit broader. Crimea pre-2014 was an autonomous republic in Ukraine. So we've established it was an autonomous republic in Ukraine. 2014, beginning of 2014 in Ukraine, you had what was called the Euromaidan crisis, where it was essentially a schism between those who wanted to have closer ties with Russia and those who wanted to have closer ties with the West. Crimea, during this whole process, decided, as an autonomous republic can, at least it could in Ukraine, decided to vote to become an independent nation, and then after that voted within its own legislature to become a part of Russia. This raised a lot of alarm bells across the world, because it seemed as though Russia did a soft takeover of the country, a soft annexation of the country, as opposed to this being a genuine democratic transfer of land. Though international community didn't really buy Russia's approach, saying, well, Crimea voted to do this because it said, yeah, well, the people of South Ossetia and Abkhazia in the Georgian Republic didn't really vote for this either. So there's a lot of doubt, but at the same time, there's been a lot of frustrations emanating from this. So recently, and this is what I'll talk on specifically, Ukraine has shut off all water going to Crimea, and Russia can't provide them with water because all the water comes from Ukraine. And so it's a big human security problem, first and foremost. It's a challenge between nation states, but now it's affecting individual people, because you now see with Ukraine shutting off water, Russia's then protesting, saying you can't do that. Well, this is an internationally delineated border, but no one recognizes Crimea as being a part of Russia. And so this is a problem, and at the same time, people are suffering. And so if I could wave a magic wand, I would take this to the International Court of Justice, and I would make them mandate that water be restored to Crimea, because people will soon be dying from this. It's essentially a man-made drought on the Crimean Peninsula because Ukraine is upset that Russia annexed the land. The annexation of the land is a completely different issue. And I don't really want to talk about that because there's a lot of people who do, but not enough people are talking about the human security component of, people are dying and suffering, and this will continue if Ukraine keeps doing this. But at the same time, Ukraine can feel justified because it's, according to international law, it's their land. They didn't consent to this takeover. And so if I could wave a magic wand, I would restore water rights to those living on the Crimean Peninsula, many of whom are native Crimean Tatars, who are an ancient group who've been living there for thousands of years. Many ethnic Russians as well, and ethnic Ukrainians. So that would be a first step to resolving this conflict. It's not an end all be all solution, but it's a good first step, which you can't, like Andrew talked about, you can't have too many goals. You have to start with you got to, put the Band-Aid on before you can, actually do the long-term healing. And so this is like a Band-Aid solution, but it's a good first step.
It is a very sophisticated issue. And any of this that we are talking about, it depends on what lenses you are using to assess the situation. But I appreciate your initiative by using your magic wand and restore water to all those individuals. That is terrific. As a child, my father would travel all over the world because that was his job. He worked in a cruise line company. And I remember growing up hearing from my father the beautiful things that he found in beautiful countries that he had visited. And probably one of his favorite countries of all was Venezuela. And I remember that my father would say all the time, Venezuela and Cuba are the two most powerful nations because you could have 3 harvests per year. They have so many natural resources. It is a beautiful country, beautiful people, and it could be one of the most potential and wealthiest nations in the world. Now, in our common discussion, when we talk about Venezuela and Cuba, what has happened to those gorgeous countries? Where are we? Where are they? And Andrew, what's going on in Venezuela?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I'm glad you brought that up. It's so important to understand that Venezuela is really one of the most interesting countries they have a beautiful history. They have a great background. They have so many natural resources, and it's really a beautiful place. So it really is unfortunate that there are so many issues in Venezuela, because like you said, Venezuela could be one of the most profitable countries in the world, but it's not. Um, so just as some brief background, I think it's interesting. We've been talking a lot about kind of conflict zones, and Venezuela has certainly been a conflict zone, but maybe not in the same way we've been talking about before this. So as some brief background to this, so you have, Chavez rose to power during kind of the latter half of the 20th century. You have Chavez rising to power, enter the 21st century. Chavez kind of maintains this power. There's a 2002 revolution where he's ousted, and then he comes back because of popular support. And then, Chavez dies. Chavez, though a dictator, the country was relatively stable under Chavez. Not that he just had a lot of popular support. And I think it's important to note that once Chavez passed the mantle of the presidency down to Maduro, Maduro didn't have that same kind of popular support. And I would also say, I think there's a newer, younger generation in Venezuela that's certainly pushing forward for reforms and things like that. So whereas, in the Chavez administration, people might have been comfortable because Venezuela was growing really rapidly, they were building really expansively, they might not have had the actual underpinnings to a successful society. So I wanted to provide some statistics, kind of like you said, Dr. Lago, to talk about where we are today. So Venezuela is a country of about 28 million people. The next two statistics are heartbreaking. You have 96% of people in poverty. 70% of the people are in extreme poverty. The average income is around 72 cents per day. So you have a country where it's this beautiful country. It is illustrious. It has so many natural resources, yet 96% of people are in poverty. Current inflation is estimated to be around 10 million%. For comparison, the next highest is Argentina, which is about 43%. So you're talking about a country that has just experienced massive economic upheaval, largely due to mismanagement by the Maduro regime on natural resources, corruption within the government. And so anyway, I wanted to also briefly touch on COVID-19, because that COVID-19, Venezuela claims that they have about 6,000, or maybe it's up to about 8,000 cases of COVID-19 right now, but those numbers are certainly unreliable. Some of the research I've looked into, the people are saying there are tens of thousands of cases, tens of thousands of people dying. There's overcrowding in these low income areas and in prisons, which is just their hotbed for disease. So I thought that was an important thing to mention about Venezuela as well. So there's two aspects I wanted to talk about specifically in relation to Venezuela. Venezuela has a really interesting relationship with the world. The world has pretty much cut off Venezuela. So they've gone through these very kind of unique paths to maintain control within the country, specifically the Maduro regime. So first is China. So in 2019, or in 2018, there was presidential elections, and in those presidential elections, Juan Guaido, the leader of the opposition movement, claimed that he won. Maduro claimed that he won. The U.S. and a lot of allies backed Guaido, and then China and Russia backed Maduro. So China has had a long influence in Venezuela. During the crisis in Venezuela, during some of the popular revolution or some of the popular discontent that happened kind of in 2018, 2019, China actually supplied riot gear equipment, supplied personnel management equipment, and assisted them through their financial crisis. So China has been kind of the lifeline to Venezuela throughout the time of the Maduro regime. I'd also mention that it's important to note that Maduro has promised very illustrious benefits to the Chinese and Russians. In fact, in 2018, he actually claimed he was going to raise oil exports to 1 million barrels per day, rain or shine. I will note that hasn't actually happened. In fact, Venezuela has largely shut down its oil production. They have one refinery, at least over the summer. They had one active refinery. They may be up to 2 or 3, but in terms of a country that had hundreds of oil refineries, being down to one, they're not able to deliver on those promises. But China is still supporting them because China wants to make sure that the U.S. doesn't get our way in Venezuela. The other is this really interesting parallel security system that they call the Collectivos. So the Collectivos are a really interesting group to study in Venezuela. They operate as almost a parallel security system to the government. So Maduro and Chavez have disbanded. They disbanded the Metropolitan Police. they still have a standing army, they still have armed forces that are loyal to Maduro, but they don't actually have like a local police department or any sort of local law enforcement. They actually defer that to these groups they call the Collectivos. You can see pictures of them here. That's Maduro handling one of the assault rifles that a Collectivo member has. That's not an army person. That's a local community member that is helping to keep the Maduro regime in power. So it's really interesting because they originally started as what they call the Bolivarian circles. During the 2002 revolution, Chavez called for the people to defend the revolution, and he said, to do that we need to make sure that we that we have these groups defending our revolution. And then since then, it's kind of led into what they call the Collectivos, and the Collectivos maintain law and order for the Maduro regime, and they operate largely outside of any official laws. They distribute food, they distribute water, they maintain peace and order in the neighborhoods, and they're given in exchange, because they have to receive something in exchange because Venezuela has no money. They're given access to illegal drugs. They're giving to oil revenues. They give them a portion of the oil revenues. They let them take the first cut of the food and water. And so I think it's just interesting because when you look at China and when you look at the Collectivos, you have two very parallel experiences happening in Venezuela. So Venezuela has been the target of US and international sanctions. And so, of course, they have to defer to something else. One last thing I wanted to mention about the Collectivos, this is just a picture of what a typical Collectivo member looks like. They're usually heavily armed, but the interesting thing is they use them for crime and social control. But Maduro has recently developed this group that he calls the Fies. Let's see, they're not showing up. Anyway, it's like a political shock troopers, essentially. And so these political shock troopers are hired from the Collectivos. So you have this parallel security system that's developing, and now you have these heavily armed, and you go from just like citizen defenders to actually highly armed special forces, and they're recruiting from one another. So it's a way that Maduro kind of integrates people that support his regime into this like parallel security force that has they drug traffic, they torture, they extort, they rob, they oppress the political rivals of Maduro. And so it's just a really interesting situation in Venezuela. So again, kind of going back to the magic wand, I think there's a few important things you can do in Venezuela. First of all, decreasing Chinese and Russian influence in the region. That's been kind of the last stand of Venezuela has been the international support from China and Russia. The second thing is to target the Collectivos. The Collectivos are integral to the support. I personally believe the reason why the popular uprisings in kind of 2018, 2019 didn't actually succeed is probably because the Collectivos were maintaining security. They go into protests, they'll shoot people, they'll throw like gas and stuff to get these protesters to disperse. So I think by targeting the Collectivos, which is targeting this parallel security force, which we don't really do now as an international community, that's an important way we can reduce conflict in Venezuela. And then again, just supporting the opposition movement. And there was another really interesting thing is if the Collectivos are the one distributing the aid, how do you give official aid to these government, how do you give official aid to the government? And there's a really interesting way to circumvent it, and that's through using blockchain and Bitcoin, and some of these new financial solutions have actually allowed individual aid organizations to receive individual donations. So just a little bit about the Venezuela conflict.
Thank you, Andrew. It's so unfortunate, isn't it? It's so complicated, the whole situation in Venezuela. We're going to move to their last scenario. And yesterday, President, or I would say the Biden administration, was put to the test by this nation that has had a lot of influence even during the previous administration and good relations with President Trump. But now again, they're moving forward with whatever agenda they may have. As we all know, North Korea yesterday launched 2 ballistic missiles. They were short range, thank heavens, but we're back in the same plan or play, whatever you want to call it, as we were 4 years ago. Lee, what are your thoughts on the North Korea conflict?
Well, similarly to other conflicts, there's a long-standing history that helps to explain why it is the way it is today. To speak about the recent events with the missiles, obviously Biden wants to reassure the American public that it was, I believe he said it was non-provocative, but I would argue that most displays of those missiles are typically just to, show off a little bit political and perhaps military prowess, just to remind the world from North Korea's perspective that, hey, we're still here, we're still an active presence. Similar as I discussed with Iran, we still have nuclear presence in the world, and so for a country that I would say has adopted a lot of isolationist policies, it's very interesting that they would want to tout this military capabilities to the world. However, I think that's just trying to save face for other things going on in the country. North Korea is a little bit of an anomaly because even though it does have certain alliances with neighboring states, like Russia, China, for trade. Even though there's this North Korea, South Korea split, there is still a lot of economic trade that takes place between North and South Korea. However, if you speak to a Korean, chances are they're just going to refer to Korea as Korea. So in many aspects, both countries are still one and the same. The distinction really has boiled down to this post-Cold War, Russia takes North Korea, the US and allies kind of take South Korea as allies. This 38th parallel drawn, again, an arbitrary border. We see how effective those are in world politics today. So really, when it comes down to trying to, I guess, resolve a conflict, I mean, I would use the term transform the conflict rather than resolving it. My magic wand, again, would be to try to take away nuclear arms. They seem to be more problematic than more of a solution, and to kind of let both Koreas handle things on their own. I mean, a country that doesn't really want any sort of relationship with many parts of the world has made it very clear, especially with the current regime, is a little bit more belligerent than most other countries in the region. It's hard to establish diplomatic relationships when you have this military threat that's just looming over your head of, hey, let's be buddies, but if not, we can always just nuke each other and kind of blow each other up. So to me, that's a very ineffective way of managing a relationship. I always like to think about states as people. Why would you go to someone you want to make a friend with and say, hey, if this doesn't work out, we each have a knife or a gun or a rope or whatever. We each have a way to kill each other. I mean, you just doom the relationship from the get-go. And so that's what, I'm a liberalist at heart. I fully believe in international cooperation. However, realism has a very compelling argument. If states are run by humans, and human nature is to, unfortunately, be afraid and be afraid of the unknown and to kind of be more egocentric, the state is going to behave in the same way. It just becomes a lot more complicated when you have very powerful weapons that can help feed your argument or feed your agenda. So North Korea, I like to say that the Cold War, yes, maybe it had some sort of on the paper official end, but the Cold War is still very much full in force. You have the US and Russia still trying to pick up allies, still trying to one up each other. It's been this rivalry for decades, and North Korea is just another piece to that puzzle. However, North Korea is similar to China and many other BRIC countries, are trying to get on their own pedestal and not let the US or Russia or the UK kind of provide that pedestal for them. They're going to make it themselves through their economy, through their military, through their diplomatic institutions. I mean, I did some research for my master's capstone and found that China has more diplomatic missions than the US. So China really is trying to, gain a solid footstool in the diplomatic market. North Korea, on the other side, is a little bit more selective. They pick and choose who they want to have relations with. They kind of tout this prowess that they're really strong and very thriving. But if you look at the country, the country suffers. They have to do a lot of trade because they either can't produce the food or the materials on their own. And a lot of that has to do with how the war, the Korean Civil War took place, U.S. intervention. It's kind of devastated the land. And so when you look at that, it helps justify why North Koreans say, well, the US, they're just these bad people. They're just trying to take us over. It's what they're indoctrinated from at a young age. I mean, there's plenty of documentaries that you can watch now that North Korea has kind of opened up minimally this world to their world to the rest of the world through photos or video. But it's very much this is what this is how I really believe that North Korea believes themselves to be the true Koreans, and they're trying to persuade South Korea to do the same, to join with us. You'll be subject to North Korea, and we'll just become Korea, and this is how we'll rule the world. No, I don't know. I don't think they have some sort of let's rule the world. But it's hard. With the Trump administration and North Korea, there were tons of up and downs. It'll be very interesting to see how the Biden administration handles it. My guess is it'll be very similar to the Obama administration, in that President Biden will make it very clear that there are many things he doesn't agree with North Korea, that he's going to try, maybe to work out some solution. But I don't think he's going to try that hard, because on his list of priorities, there are many other states that he needs to, to kind of cozy back up to. And yes, North Korea has nuclear arms, but I think it's still too early to see if North Korea would try to send those long range. For them, it would be an immediate death sentence if they did that, and North Korea knows that.
Thank you, Lee. I think that your arguments there are well taken, and I think it's, again, like the other nations that we have been discussing this morning, are a very serious conflicts and very complicated solutions. And but we love your opinion. We love your thought. I think that today we have been well taught by the three of you. And due to time limitation, I'm going to reduce all the questions that we had just to a final question. And I would just want to throw it to the three of you. And if we can keep that to a maximum of 5 minutes, that would be fantastic, because I know that some of you have other commitments at noon. The SDG has multiple indicators, right? And one of them, we talked about conflict resolution and stop of violence, but this one that I want to talk about is being very recent, within this week, actually. And I just want your opinion. SDG 16 promotes the rule of law at the national and international levels, and ensure equal access to justice for all. Just a few days ago, Secretary of State Lloyd Austin met with his Chinese counterpart in Alaska. As you all remember, it was in the news. China accused the United States of America of human rights violations, primarily due to the most recent Black Lives Matter movement and most recent deaths among Asians, especially women. This is a perception coming from an outsider with a severe political agenda. Now, let's be realistic. When I heard that initially, I thought, excuse me, you're accusing the US. And I imagine that most of the population in the United States are thinking the same way, right? I mean, who is speaking here to tell us that we are violating human rights? But that's the way we are being viewed. So the question that I have for the three of you is, indeed, are we violating human rights in the USA? And please, I welcome your counter arguments. What are your thoughts?
I'm happy. I'm happy to start. I think, unfortunately, the U.S., like any country, has a long and difficult relationship with so many different facets of life, right? You have gender, you have race, you have so many issues that the U.S. has faced, just like any other country. And I think we're not immune to that by any means. Now, I would add, I think it's a little bit different, when you consider exactly how China's been operating over the last few years, because I'd argue China largely operates in a similar way as the US. Though I think this is just part of China's posturing, which is, China says we're looking to help all countries. We're looking to help by supplying you with our social credit system, with all of our artificial intelligence that we've developed to help control populations. So I think part of this is just Chinese posturing. I think they want to look more appealing than the United States. And I think similar to how Russia exploits it, I think they exploit the internal divisions that are present in the US as well. We're absolutely not immune to having divisions that are fracturing our country right now. And so I think China is just kind of using that to leverage to say, hey, other countries, look, America is having all these issues. They have all these human rights abuses and all these issues they're going through. We can provide you with the help you need. So not to say that I would excuse the US in any means. I think we certainly have had our fair share of tough lessons we've learned and a lot of issues we've had. But at the same time, I would say I don't think China is necessarily justified in saying, look at your BLM protests, look at the human rights violations. That's more a result of the fracturing of our society, which I absolutely agree with. And there are certainly things that happened over the summer. You had a lot of injustices that occurred. And so anyway, I would just say, I think while the US is not immune, China is certainly not in a position to say that to us.
Thank you, Andrew. Love your thoughts there. Lee, do you have any comments?
Yeah, so along similar lines, I watched the video and my first reactions were very similar. I think to put it into a little bit more context, this is coming from a Chinese diplomat's perspective of the last few years where politics have been very divisive, polarized. I think we've had a president who didn't step up to the plate a little bit when it came to race and minority relations. And someone who was a little bit more aggressive with Chinese relations. So I think there's a little bit of an emotional component to it, just kind of, for lack of a better term, venting to the Secretary of State, the incumbent. And so I think that's an element to it as well. I would counter argue and say it's not a violation of human rights. Those who have been feeling oppressed, have experienced it, they were able to express their freedom of the right to assembly. The U.S. is fully on board with that constitutional right, and fully lets that happen. So while there might be some rights or some privileges that have been neglected or diminished, I think there are some that the U.S. has unfortunately prioritized, rather than doing a full across the board, of all rights. Now, when it comes to China, they've come under fire for the way they treat minority ethnic groups, especially in their in their western provinces. We hear talk about concentration camps, labor reform. These are things that China is also guilty of. And so, if you want to talk about there being some sort of white versus black or white versus people of color or whatever the ethnic dynamic is, there is still diversity in China of ethnicity, of language, of religion, that I don't believe the Chinese government fully acknowledges that there is a lot of oppression. And in fact, if there's some sort of incarceration, I would say that's much, much worse than anything that's been reported by the Black Lives Matter movement. And so while yes, it's true, like Andrew said, the US isn't above any sort of reprimand. No country is. Every country deals with these kinds of issues. If we want to talk about international cooperation, finger pointing is the last thing that you want to do because it never gets anywhere. It's never a constructive solution.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lee. Samuel, last thoughts.
Yeah, I think I agree with what's been said. I think it's pretty rich coming from the Chinese government personally, that we're like, so it's rich coming from them because of the treatment they give to ethnic minorities within their own country. There's a reason this whole, decades ago was free Tibet. Now it's free the Uyghurs, because there's credible, reporting from like BBC and independent EU commissions that the Chinese government is actively engaged in genocide. So it's pretty rich coming from them. that we have a problem. However, with that being said, I absolutely do think there is a problem here. And I think as the United States, we are not the bastion of all that is good and beautiful and amazing in the world, because we do see that racial minorities here in the United States are disproportionately more likely to be incarcerated and disproportionately more likely to be killed by a police officer. And so in response to the Black Lives Matter stuff, I think absolutely, but it's like the pot calling the kettle black. You can't point fingers and say, you guys have a problem. It's like, so for China to say that to us, it falls on deaf ears. And really it would fall on deaf ears for any country to tell us that we have a problem with racism, because there are problems in every country with prejudice and discrimination. And so this is something as a globe, as a world community, that we need to be better at addressing, because we absolutely have problems here in the United States that need radical fixes, which the SDGs are trying to bring about. But at the same time, I don't really want to hear it from the Chinese government that we have a problem when they're actively incarcerating arbitrarily millions of people who are an ethnic minority. So there's, it's a discussion that we need to have, but it's a discussion we need to have where we all need to recognize that we've got some elements of prejudice that we need to address. The United States is really bad. We've got a really bad history of it, but so does every other country. So we really need to have that discussion.
Thank you, Samuel. Indeed, we do have our issues. We're not immune to any of these discussions, definitely. And I think that hopefully individuals will communicate, will dialogue, and will come to some solutions, which that is, as you mentioned, Samuel, that is part of the SDG 16th. I mean, what can we do to prevent these scenarios? Gentlemen, it has been a pleasure and a privilege to spend this hour with the three of you. It gives me hope. It gives me hope that students have that mind, that have that desire to promote not only the SDGs, but also to make our place a little more peaceful and to provide prosperity for future generations. I'm grateful that educators have enticed in your hearts the delight and the excitement, and to become actually activists on some of these issues and concerns that we have shared today. As I mentioned, it gives me hope, and I do thank you for your time. And I thank everyone that has been able to follow these proceedings, and they will be later on watching them through Facebook media as well as through our YouTube channel. For your information, next Tuesday, March 13th, we will be hosting through our global dialogues, Dr. Scott Springer, president of the American University of Rome. We will be visiting with him. He will be in Rome in Italy, and we will be doing it from here, but it will be interesting to see his perspective on American education abroad, and also what's taking place in regards to COVID and what's happening with Italy currently. And I also want you to make sure that you save this date, because it's going to be one of the greatest panels for the entire academic year. And that's going to happen on April 6th at 11 o'clock. The panel titled Return to Puttingrad, and the panelist is the world-renowned author, Mr. Franz Sedlmayr, and also Dr. Fred White, an expert on Russian studies. And we may even have a little surprise coming in through the panel with President Jimenez. To see the full global schedule, to see the full schedule of all our global dialogues and previous programs, please access our website at uvu.edu/global. Again, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me this morning. And as we sign off, choose to be a global citizen. Thank you, and have a wonderful day to all.